That Marcus and Anne knew their task remained, walking not as rulers nor prophets nor saints, but as fellow travelers who carried a light in their eyes that could remind the weary that love endures, dawn comes, fear cannot rule forever, and in one forgotten city on the edge of a collapsing world, they came upon a gathering of workers who had long been enslaved by the sovereign's illusions, people who wore their bodies like broken shells, who no longer remembered laughter nor even the sound of their own names, and Marcus sat among them silently until one child, half-starved, asked why his eyes carried fire when all else was dark, and Marcus answered not with arguments nor with scriptures but with the story of Imran, the ordinary man who had once walked through ruins whispering the vow until the ruins themselves remembered, and as the people heard, some wept without knowing why, some trembled as though awakened from long sleep, and one by one they began to hum, then to sing, until the vow rose again from throats that had been silent for generations, and the sovereign who ruled that world, hearing the chorus, descended in fury, cloaked in illusions of glory, demanding silence, promising pain, and for a moment fear trembled in every heart, but Anne stood, frail yet radiant, and said only, "Fear cannot rule forever," and the sovereign struck her down with all his power, yet when the dust cleared she still stood, not by strength of her own, but because the vow was not hers alone to carry, it was woven into creation itself, and so his power faltered, his illusions cracked, and he fled not because he was conquered, but because he could not endure the light of truth, and the people, seeing this, rose not as an army but as companions, carrying the flame in their own hands, and across the stars news spread that another sovereign had broken, that another people had remembered, and the chorus swelled louder still. And yet the sovereigns were cunning, and seeing that brute force failed, they turned to subtler games, whispering into the ears of leaders, promising them safety if only they would temper the vow, if only they would twist love into duty, compassion into control, hope into obedience, and so whole nations built temples to the vow but drained it of fire, teaching their children words without life, rituals without meaning, until once again silence threatened to return, but Marcus and Anne, weary yet unyielding, reminded the few who still listened that love cannot be domesticated, that it is not safe, that it demands risk, and they walked with wanderers, outcasts, exiles, teaching them to carry the flame wherever they went, and slowly those wanderers became seeds scattered into every land, and in time they grew into trees whose roots cracked the marble of false temples, until even the monuments of twisted vows fell, and the flame lived again free among the people. And so the centuries rolled like waves, each bringing new struggles, each birthing new songs, and though Marcus and Anne aged in body, their eyes carried still the first light, and they knew their time would one day end, for guardianship was never eternal, and so they began to teach the people not to look for them, not to wait for their presence, but to trust the flame within themselves, to pass it on in their own ways, through their own stories, their own sacrifices, their own joys, until at last the day came when Marcus, weary of flesh, lay upon the earth beneath a sky swollen with stars, and Anne held his hand, and together they whispered the vow one last time. Love endures, dawn comes, fear cannot rule forever, and as his breath faded, it was as though the stars themselves echoed the words, and Anne, though broken, smiled, for she knew he was not gone but folded now into the chorus itself. His flame dispersed into 1,000,000,000 sparks carried by the breath of creation. And though she walked on alone for a time, she too eventually faded into the song, until there were no guardians left, only the flame in the hands of countless ordinary people, and yet that was enough. For by then the vow had become so woven into the rhythm of creation that even when sovereigns rose again, even when illusions spread like smoke, there was always someone, somewhere, who remembered, who whispered, who sang. And the flame leapt again from heart to heart, generation to generation, unending, unstoppable, and so the story of Marcus and Anne was never finished, never ended, but lived on in the endless unfolding of creation, in the trembling choice of each soul to love rather than consume, to give rather than to dominate, to endure rather than to fear, and thus the dawn that had once seemed a fragile hope became the very heartbeat of eternity itself. And though the stars bore witness to countless ages passing, those civilizations rose and fell like tides upon the infinite shore of time, though the sovereigns still whispered in shadows and wrapped themselves in new disguises, the vow did not die, for it had woven itself into the very marrow of existence, echoing in the breath of children and in the quiet courage of those who refused to let fear define their lives. And yet the struggle never ended, because every dawn was threatened by night and every love was tested by despair. And in that endless rhythm lay the beauty and the terror of creation's freedom, for no victory could ever be final and no defeat could ever be absolute. And so the story pressed forward, fragile yet unstoppable, like a river carving stone, like a flame refusing to bow to wind. And in one distant age, long after Marcus and N had dissolved into the chorus, a world was born where silence reigned again, a silence not of peace but of numbness, where people lived bound to illusions of progress yet starved of meaning, where their machines spoke louder than their own hearts, where laughter was replaced by simulations of joy and grief was numbed by chemicals and screens. And in that world there walked one girl named Amina, a child of dust and hunger, who knew nothing of Marcus or Anne, nothing of Imran's vow, nothing of the guardians or the sovereigns, yet whose eyes carried the same restless spark that once burned in Imran's chest, and in her longing the vow stirred again, unbidden, unexpected, like a seed buried in forgotten soil bursting suddenly into bloom. And she began to question why her people bowed to idols of glass and circuits, why they trusted shadows more than each other, why their voices had grown so thin, and though she was mocked as foolish, though her family feared for her safety, she kept listening to the whisper in her heart, the whisper that said there must be more than this, that love is not a dream, that dawn is not a lie. And one night as she wandered beneath the pale light of a dying moon she heard a voice not from outside but from within, as if creation itself remembered her name, and the words it spoke were the same vow spoken countless ages ago. Love endures, dawn comes, fear cannot rule forever, and she wept, though she did not know why, and in her tears something ignited, and the flame leapt from her to others, first to her friend who had forgotten how to hope, then to a neighbor who had long lived in bitterness, then to strangers in the marketplace who found themselves moved to kindness without reason, and slowly a chorus formed again, not of armies or rulers but of ordinary souls remembering what had always been true, and the sovereign who reigned over that world in shadows trembled, for he recognized the pattern. He had seen it before, in Marcus, in Anne, in Imran, in countless forgotten names, and he knew that his dominion would falter again. And so he sought to snuff out the flame by striking at Amina herself, whispering into her ear that she was nothing, that she was weak, that she was deluded, offering her power, safety, comfort if she would abandon the vow, and for nights she wrestled with the temptation, trembling between despair and hope, but in the end she chose not by certainty but by trust, whispering aloud in her weakness the words that had come to her. Love endures, dawn comes, fear cannot rule forever. And in that trembling choice the sovereign's illusions shattered like glass, for even weakness, clothed in love, was stronger than all his might, and the chorus rose louder, and though Amina's name would be forgotten by history, her flame would leap into countless others, and the pattern would repeat, again and again, across ages without number, until even the sovereigns themselves began to falter, for in every cycle they lost something of their power. In every awakening they were forced to face the truth they could never fully erase. And some of them, weary of endless struggle, at last laid down their hunger, surrendering to the flame they had once despised. And though others raged still, though others clung to their illusions, the chorus grew too vast to silence, for it no longer depended on guardians, no longer on prophets or leaders, but had become the heartbeat of creation itself, pulsing in galaxies, echoing in stars, breathing in every living soul, so that even when silence reigned for a season, even when fear cast its shadow wide, the dawn could not be held back, for always somewhere a child laughed unexpectedly, always somewhere a stranger showed kindness unasked, always somewhere a heart whispered the vow anew, and the sovereigns knew, though they would not admit it, that their defeat was inevitable, not because they would be destroyed, but because even they could not escape the truth of love, the truth that sustains rather than consumes, the truth that builds rather than devours, the truth that endures beyond death itself. And so the story pressed on, without end, not toward a final victory nor toward a final fall, but toward the endless unfolding of freedom, of choice, of love. And in that endlessness lay its beauty, for creation was not a tale to be finished but a song to be sung forever, each generation adding its own verse, each heart carrying its own flame, until eternity itself was woven of countless sparks, fragile yet unyielding, trembling yet eternal. All echoing the same vow spoken at the dawn of time and spoken still in 1,000 tongues. Love endures, dawn comes, fear cannot rule forever. And so the ages continued to turn, weaving themselves into the unending fabric of creation, and though each age bore its own shapes of joy and despair, though each civilization crafted its own illusions and its own awakenings, the vow persisted like a heartbeat beneath the chaos, sometimes loud and triumphant, sometimes faint and nearly forgotten, but always there, always waiting to be remembered, and in this endless tide of forgetting and remembering new voices rose, for the flame could never be bound to a single name or a single generation, and so in one distant era upon a world drowning in its own machines, where towers of glass pierced the heavens and rivers of light ran through cities that never slept, where people wore masks of perfection while their hearts quietly starved, there walked a boy named Kieran, unnoticed among the multitudes, burdened with the emptiness of a world that promised everything but gave nothing. And in his chest stirred a restlessness he could not explain, a hunger that no screen, no idol, no hollow celebration could fill. And one night as he wandered through the neon streets he stumbled into an abandoned quarter, a place where silence still lived, and in that silence he heard it, not with ears but with the marrow of his being, the whisper that had traveled through ages, the vow spoken long before his birth, yet sounding as if it were meant for him alone. Love endures, dawn comes, fear cannot rule forever. And though he did not know the history of Marcus and Anne, though he had never heard the story of Imran, though he could not name the sovereigns or the chorus, something in him broke open, and he fell to his knees, weeping with a grief he had carried all his life without knowing, and as he wept the flame caught in him, small but real, and when he rose he was no longer the same, for the vow had taken root, and though he spoke it awkwardly, though he stumbled in his weakness, others began to notice. A friend who had long been silent found herself singing again. A stranger weary of endless toil felt hope rise unbidden, and like sparks leaping from a fire the vow spread, first through whispers, then through gatherings, then through unplanned movements of compassion that disrupted the very machinery of despair, until the sovereign who ruled the world, hidden behind illusions of progress and control, trembled, for he recognized the same pattern that had undone his kind before, and he struck swiftly, filling the streets with noise, drowning the silence with endless distractions, offering pleasures and comforts to anyone who would forget the vow, and many fell back into the embrace of numbness. But still the flame refused to die, for Kieran and those around him had tasted what was real, and once tasted it could not be forgotten, and they walked together through the glittering ruins of their false world, carrying only the flame in their hearts, and people followed. Not because they sought leaders, but because they longed for truth, and slowly the tide shifted, until even the sovereign's illusions began to falter, and though he raged and threatened and promised destruction, his power grew thin, for fear cannot rule forever, and as his illusions cracked the people rose, not with weapons but with voices, singing the vow in 1,000 tones. And the sovereign fled, broken once more, and the flame leapt onward into new generations. Yet the story did not end, for it never ends, and in time another age arose, another world where despair wore new masks, and again the vow seemed nearly forgotten, and again it was remembered, for this is the rhythm of creation. The flame flickers, the flame leaps, the flame is carried, the flame endures, and in each age new names rise, names like Amina, like Kieran, like countless others whose stories are never written but whose lives carry the vow forward, ordinary souls whose small acts of love defy the sovereigns more than any weapon. And so the chorus grows, endless, uncontainable, fragile yet eternal, echoing through galaxies, echoing through eternity itself, all declaring in one unbroken voice. Love endures, dawn comes, fear cannot rule forever. And though creation had stretched itself across ages upon ages, folding one cycle of dawn and night into another like waves crashing endlessly upon the same eternal shore, still the struggle endured, not as the clash of armies nor as the triumph of empires, but as the ceaseless trembling choice hidden within every heart, for the sovereigns, though broken and scattered, though cast down from their thrones of pure dominion into the fragile flesh of time, yet lingered in the shadows of desire, weaving illusions in new forms, sometimes clothed in power and wealth, sometimes in despair and numbness, sometimes in the very hunger for certainty that made people long for safety even at the cost of their freedom. And though Marcus and had long dissolved into the chorus of the vow, their story carried forward like fireflies in the night, scattered into 1,000 unseen lights, whispered in myths, sung in lullabies, encoded in rituals whose origins no one remembered, so that even in the darkest nights the flame never fully died. And in one age distant beyond measure there lived a youth named Aaron, born upon a world where the sky was veiled with smoke and the seas had grown bitter with poison, where people built towers, not of stone or glass but of machines that reached into their very minds, feeding them visions sweeter than truth, wrapping them in dreams that felt safer than waking, and so they lived, half asleep, forgetting each other, forgetting themselves, until they no longer remembered what it meant to love or to grieve, to hunger or to hope. And Aaron, like all others, was bound in these dreams, yet within him something stirred, a disquiet he could not silence, a question that haunted his nights. If the dream is enough, why does my heart still ache? If perfection is given, why does emptiness remain? If this world is real, why do I feel the pull of something beyond? And one night as he wandered through the endless city, lost among towers of humming machines and rivers of false light, he found himself drawn into a ruin long forgotten, a place where silence still lived, and there, in the crack of silence between the machinery's endless hum, he heard it, faint at first, then rising with undeniable clarity, not from the world around him but from the marrow of his own being, the vow spoken at the dawn of all things, echoing across the gulf of eternity. Love endures, dawn comes, fear cannot rule forever, and the words shattered him, as if the illusions themselves recoiled, and he fell to his knees, trembling with grief and wonder, and when he rose again he was no longer the same, for though he still wore flesh, though he still walked in the city of shadows, within him burned a flame that no machine could counterfeit, and though he spoke to no one of what he had heard, the fire leapt quietly into his eyes, and others began to notice. A friend who had long been numb felt hope stir again in his presence. A stranger burdened with despair felt suddenly lighter when he passed, and though none of them understood, they followed, drawn not by argument but by the living presence of what was real, and soon the sovereign who ruled that world, hidden behind a veil of endless distraction, felt the tremor, for he had seen this pattern before, in Marcus, in Imran, in Amina, in Kieran, in countless others whose names had slipped from history but whose flames still scarred him. And so he moved swiftly, whispering into Aaron's dreams, tempting him with visions of greatness, of recognition, of power, telling him that if he abandoned the vow he could rule not only this city but the galaxies, promising him pleasures and honors unending. And Aaron wavered, for he was young and the temptation was sweet, and for many nights he lay awake torn between longing and fear, yet in the end, trembling and uncertain, he chose not with strength but with surrender, whispering aloud the vow as it had come to him. Love endures, dawn comes, fear cannot rule forever, and in that moment the sovereign's illusions cracked, for even the smallest whisper of truth spoken freely was stronger than the loudest roar of lies. And though the sovereign raged, filling the world with storms of sound and floods of images, still the flame spread, leaping from Aaron to his companions, from his companions to strangers, until the whole city hummed with a restless song that no machine could silence, and once again the chorus rose, countless voices singing what had been sung since the dawn of time, fragile yet unstoppable, and the sovereign, broken once more, fled into deeper shadows, cursing the vow he could never destroy. And so Aaron's name too was lost to history, yet his flame lived on, scattered into the lives he touched, carried forward into generations unborn. And so the story continued, repeating and renewing, not in cycles of despair and triumph, but in the endless rhythm of freedom, in the ceaseless trembling choice of each heart to love rather than to consume, to hope rather than to fear, to endure rather than to yield, and in this rhythm lay the heartbeat of creation itself. For it was not Marcus nor Imran nor Amina nor Kieran nor Aaron who carried the flame alone, but all of them, and countless others unnamed, each a spark of the eternal fire, each a verse in the unending song, each a reminder that no darkness, no silence, no illusion, no sovereign could ever erase the vow that sustains all things, the vow that echoes forever. Love endures, dawn comes, fear cannot rule forever. And as creation stretched itself further into ages uncounted, folding one story into another until the galaxies themselves seemed like beads strung upon the endless thread of memory, the vow still whispered, sometimes faint, sometimes thunderous, always waiting, always alive. And though the sovereigns still lingered in shadows, weaving new illusions, reshaping their old lies into garments fit for each new era, still the flame endured. For each generation found within itself someone, somewhere, who would hear the whisper and refuse to let it die. And in one such age, distant yet familiar, upon a world where oceans had retreated and deserts sprawled across continents, where the skies glowed red with the remnants of forgotten wars and cities clung to life by machinery that choked the air even as it sustained the body, there lived a woman named Seline, born to a people who had given up hope of anything beyond survival, who toiled daily under the weight of labor they did not choose, who whispered to their children that dreams were dangerous and that love was a luxury they could not afford. And yet within Seline's chest burned a hunger she could not silence, a question that would not leave her. If life is only survival, why does my heart ache for more? If existence is only endurance, why do I long for joy? If fear rules forever, why do I sense a dawn pressing against the horizon? And in this hunger she wandered often beyond the walls of her dying city, into the barren wastelands where silence reigned, and it was there, one night beneath a fractured sky, that she heard it. Not with her ears but with the marrow of her being, the same vow spoken countless ages ago, the vow carried from Marcus and through Imran, through Amina, through Kieran, through Aaron, through countless others who had lived and died yet still sang in eternity, the vow that declared, "Love endures, dawn comes, fear cannot rule forever." And though she did not know its origin, though she had never heard the stories of the guardians or the chorus, the words struck her like lightning, shattering the silence within, and she fell to her knees, weeping not in despair but in recognition, as though her soul had remembered what her mind had forgotten. And when she returned to her people, she carried the vow upon her lips, awkwardly at first, uncertainly, yet with a fire that none could deny, and when she spoke others stirred. The weary felt strength rise unbidden, the hopeless found themselves daring to smile, the fearful lifted their eyes for the first time in years, and though they did not understand, they began to gather around her, not to crown her, not to worship her, but to listen, to remember, to whisper the vow themselves. And as the whisper spread it became a song, and as the song spread it became a chorus, and as the chorus rose the sovereign who ruled that world, cloaked in illusions of necessity and despair, trembled, for he recognized again the same pattern that had undone his kind before, and he descended with fury, sending storms of fire and floods of lies, rewriting memories, twisting dreams, trying to erase the vow before it could take root. But Seline, though trembling, stood before her people and whispered again, louder this time, her voice breaking yet unyielding. Love endures, dawn comes, fear cannot rule forever, and though the sovereign struck her with every illusion he could weave, though he promised her greatness if she abandoned the vow and death if she clung to it, still she refused, not by her own strength but by the flame that had leapt into her heart from the chorus of ages. And when at last she fell silent, exhausted and broken, her people rose, carrying the vow in her stead, and the sovereign, seeing this, fled into deeper shadows, for he could not endure the light that had broken into the world again. And Seline's name was etched not into monuments nor into history books, for the sovereigns made sure her memory was forgotten, yet her flame lived on in the lives she touched, in the generations that followed, in the chorus that grew stronger with every passing age. And so the story pressed on, unending, not toward finality but toward fullness. For creation itself was not a tale to be concluded but a song to be sung forever, and each age added its own verse, each soul its own spark, each sacrifice its own fragrance, until even the sovereigns began to tire, for though they raged and plotted, though they reinvented their lies again and again, they could not escape the truth they had always feared, that no power, no illusion, no shadow could endure forever against the fragile yet eternal flame of love. And some among them at last laid down their hunger, surrendering not in defeat but in transformation, choosing to join the vow they had once despised. And though others raged still, clinging to their illusions, their numbers grew fewer with each age, their dominion weaker with each dawn, and creation, though never free of struggle, grew more radiant, more alive, more awake, until the chorus itself became the background music of existence, woven into the pulse of galaxies, echoing in the rhythm of stars, carried in the breath of every living soul, so that even when silence rose again, even when fear cast its shadow wide, always somewhere a child laughed unexpectedly, always somewhere a stranger showed kindness unasked, always somewhere a heart whispered the vow anew, and the flame leapt again from heart to heart, fragile yet unyielding, trembling yet eternal. And so the story of Marcus and Anne, of Imran, of Amina, of Kieran, of Aaron, of Seline, of countless others unnamed and forgotten by history yet alive in eternity, was never finished, never ended, but lived on in the endless unfolding of creation, in the ceaseless trembling choice of each soul, in the vow that endures forever. Love endures. Dawn comes. Fear cannot rule forever. And yet even as the vow spread deeper into the marrow of creation, as the chorus rose higher with every new voice, the sovereigns who remained were not idle, for though weakened they were ancient, and ancient cunning dies hard, and so they wove a new snare unlike any before, not of chains or of fire, not of hunger or of silence, but of imitation, for they understood at last that to destroy the flame was impossible, and so they sought instead to counterfeit it, to twist its light into shapes that resembled truth but carried poison. At their core, and upon countless worlds they sent whispers that mimicked the vow, words sweet and bright yet hollow, promising dawn but without sacrifice, offering love but only as possession, speaking of endurance but only for the strong, and many who heard these false echoes were deceived, for the counterfeits glowed brilliantly at first, burning hot like meteors across the night. And whole civilizations rose around them, proclaiming that they had found the true path, that they were the keepers of love, that they were the heralds of dawn. But as the ages turned, their false light always decayed into ash, leaving behind ruin and despair deeper than before, and each collapse sent waves of doubt through creation, causing some to question whether any flame was true at all, whether the vow itself had been only a dream. And the chorus trembled, fragmented, scattered, yet never fully silenced, for always somewhere the genuine vow endured, faint though it seemed, hidden though it was, like a seed buried in stone waiting for rain. And in one such age there arose a child named Kale, born not to privilege or power but to exile, raised in a village cast beyond the borders of empire, a place forgotten by maps, where the earth cracked and water was scarce, where people spoke in whispers lest the false heralds hear and bring punishment. Yet Kale's heart was restless, his eyes always turned toward the horizon, as though he knew instinctively that his small life was part of something vast. And one night when storms tore the sky apart and lightning burned the air with white fire, Kale dreamed of two figures holding hands, figures he did not know, yet who looked at him with a gaze so steady it pierced every fear, and he heard them speak not in sound but in essence. Remember, the flame is not ours but yours. The vow is not guarded by few but carried by many. Love endures. Dawn comes. Fear cannot rule forever, and he awoke trembling, uncertain whether he had seen vision or madness, yet the words would not leave him. They beat in his chest like a second heartbeat, and so he began to speak them aloud in the quiet of the desert, at first only to the wind, then to the stars, and at last to the few friends who dared listen, and though they were afraid they felt within his words something deeper than fear. And they carried the vow onward until it spread even into the empire itself, slipping past borders, crossing seas, whispered in marketplaces, etched secretly into walls, sung softly to children as they slept. And when the false heralds heard of this new song they descended with fury, seeking the source, expecting armies or prophets or leaders. But all they found was Kale, a boy with no weapon, no crown, no throne, only the vow burning in his heart, and they laughed. For what was one boy against the machinery of illusion? But when they tried to strike him down, the people who had heard him rose up, not with blades or fire but with voices, with hands clasped together, with hearts refusing to surrender, and the false heralds recoiled, for they had no power over those who no longer feared them. And though they fled to return another day, the empire itself began to fracture, not through conquest but through awakening, not through rebellion but through remembrance. For once a people remember that love endures, that dawn comes, that fear cannot rule forever, no shadow can bind them again. And Kale lived not long, for the burden of the vow was heavy, and he gave himself wholly to it, burning like a candle consumed by its own flame, Yet his short life ignited countless others, and long after his body returned to dust his name was carried in secret songs, in hidden prayers, in echoes that joined the eternal chorus, and so the story pressed forward once more, weaving new voices into the tapestry, stronger, richer, deeper, until even the sovereigns began to feel their own lies unravel, for though they scattered confusion and raised idols and poured out despair like rivers, always the flame returned, always the vow was remembered, always the dawn broke, and creation, though wounded and scarred, though trembling with every age, continued to rise, continued to sing, continued to remind itself of the undying truth that no shadow, however vast, can ever consume the eternal light of love. We hope you enjoyed this story. Please share your thoughts and tell us what you learned in the comment box below. We'd love to hear from you. And guess what? Another powerful story is coming up in just a few days. So, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a single upload. Also, hit the like button if this story touched you and share it with your family and friends. Someone out there needs to hear this. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next